Gelukkig ik kan with me. Ek reilik graag ik kan with me. Gelukkig ik kan with me. Ek reilik graag ik kan with me.
James Warner was a ship carpenter in Massachusetts. He was born there in 1819. He was English, with ancestors from the British Isles. When James Warner was 31 years old, he moved to Iowa near the Mississippi River with his wife Matilda and their 5 children. Their daughter Mary was 5 years old. They had a small farm with oxen, cattle, hogs, turkeys, chickens, and a horse named Nellie. In 1861, when the Civil War broke out, James joined the Union Army. He would help to preserve the Union and free the slaves. He wrote often to his family back in Iowa, instructing his oldest son, Frank, who was 15 years old, how to run the farm. Frank wanted to join the Army, but James wrote to him, "If you're not man enough to run things at home, you will never survive the Army." James became a sergeant. He and his men had a loyal bond. They faced many hardships together in the war. James wouldn't leave his men to tend to a developing illness. In 1864, James became seriously ill. He was taken to the Vicksburg Hospital and died just 10 days before he was to ride the train home. He is buried in the Vicksburg National Cemetery in Mississippi. James Warner is my great-great-great-grandfather. James' daughter Mary grew up and married Patrick Yates. They moved to a new town called Colorado Springs, where they had 4 sons, Archie, Al, Jim, Richard, and a daughter who we call Aunt Pearl. Aunt Pearl's brother, Richard, was a very handsome man. He had a team of horses and hauled silver and gold ore in the mining camps of Leadville, Cripple Creek, Tungsten, Red Cliff, and other places. Richard married a cute, petite Irish girl named Gertrude Landrigan, whose family was originally from Kilkenny, Ireland. She and her family were devout Catholics. Gertrude was born in 1885, the same year her parents, Jack and Mary Ann, moved from Hannibal, Missouri to Leadville, Colorado. Jack was moving there to set up a blacksmith shop. Mary Ann's sister, Margaret Tobin, came with them. She was also known as Maggie and called Molly later in life. Margaret wanted to marry a rich man, but fell in love and married a poor man named J.J. Brown. But while Margaret worked in the soup kitchen, J.J. was being awarded mining shares in the Little Johnny mine. The mine eventually yielded high-grade gold, so pure and the veins so wide that it was declared the world's richest gold strike. The Browns became extremely wealthy. Margaret gave Gertrude a fur coat as a gift, but Gertrude thought her Aunt Margaret was too worldly. Margaret became a socialite who used her wealth to champion women's rights, children, and mine workers, and contributed to the relief efforts of devastated France in World War I. In 1912, she took a trip on the great ship Titanic. From that, she became a Colorado legend known worldwide as the unsinkable Molly Brown. Now, Richard and Gertrude had a son named Archie who died as a child, and they had a strong-willed red-haired girl named Loretta. Her middle name was Margaret, named after Gertrude's Aunt Margaret, Molly Brown. Loretta is my grandmother. The Irish were discriminated against and treated poorly as a lower class of people in those days. So Gertrude emphasized to Loretta that she must get an education to elevate her status in society. So Loretta went to Colorado Women's College in Greeley, Colorado, and earned a teaching degree. She told me she really wanted to get a business degree and go into business, but teaching was where the jobs were. So Loretta took a job teaching in a one-room schoolhouse near Parker, Colorado. Aunt Pearl arranged for her to stay with the Ruggles family on their ranch just off of Smoky Hill Road. And that's where Loretta met Arvid. Arvid Johnson was a strong, tall Swedish cattle rancher who loved to fly fish in the headwaters of the Colorado River. He is my grandfather. He was easygoing and hardworking. He had a good sense of humor and was always in a good mood, unless you were unkind to his sister. Then everything changed. Arvid's father, Anders Nicholas, had left Sweden about 1881 and settled 5 miles east of Parker, Colorado, with his wife, Agneta. They changed their names to Andrew and Augusta, took the last name Johnson, spoke English, and became Americans. Augusta was highly esteemed in the community and had many relatives and friends in Colorado. She worked hard to keep things clean. Andrew had a booming voice and wore a horsehair coat that looked like a bearskin. He was a generous man who took in disadvantaged boys from the boys' home, and a number of boys grew up with the greatest respect and admiration for him. Andrew donated the light plant for the Parker School. It was a generator that provided the first lights in the school building before Parker had electricity. Life was hard in those days. Andrew and Augusta's son Clarence died at 15 months. Emil died when he was 5 years old, and a daughter named Agnes died when she was 26. Arvid and Bertha were the surviving children. They worked the place, growing wheat, dryland corn, cane, and milked a handful of dairy cows by hand every day at 5 o'clock in the morning and 5 o'clock in the evening. They delivered the milk in milk cans to the creamery at Parker. One day, Arvid decided he just might need to borrow something from the Ruggles, but everyone was pretty sure he really just wanted to meet the new school teacher. Arvid and Loretta fell in love and were married in 1928. On December 14th of that year, Loretta's father, Richard, had an accident traveling along the Arkansas River after delivering a load of Christmas trees. As he crossed the bridge over the Orofano River, he crashed through the rail and plunged 30 feet to the river below. Some said it was possible that he didn't actually die from the crash, but died from hypothermia, that he froze to death during the night. At the same time, Loretta was in Elizabeth, Colorado at the doctor, delivering a baby girl. They named her Shirley Ruth Johnson. She is my mother. Shirley was very friendly and sociable. She loved our large family gatherings and had a talent for making connections with people. She knew practically everyone in the Parker area and many people throughout Douglas County. Everyone liked her. Holidays were important to Shirley. As soon as one holiday was over, she was already decorating for the next. She was enamored with Shirley Temple and learned to tap dance. Shirley was smart, a good student in school. She was a cute girl and a beautiful woman. That's my mom's story. But my dad has a story too. Evan Wallen was born in Kentucky in 1776, the same year the Declaration of Independence was signed. He grew up there while George Washington led the Continental Army to victory in the American Revolution, and when George Washington became our first president. When Evan was 35 years old, he and his wife, Nancy Jane, had a son. They named him George Washington Wallen. George Washington Wallen grew up and married Mary Ann Polly Bowman. They named his son George Washington Wallen Jr. In 1871, George Washington Wallen Jr. and his wife Jenny had a son they named William Milton Wallen. They called him Willie. Willie grew up in Kentucky and married Mary Carolyn Neal. They had 7 children, but only 4 would survive to adulthood. Willie and Mary struggled to make a living. In 1897, they moved to Macon, Missouri, but returned to Kentucky 10 years later. Then, in about 1908 or 9, they decided it was time to make a bolder move. They wanted a better life. So, Willie and Mary loaded up everything they owned into a wagon, hitched up the horses, and left Jamestown, Kentucky, with their 3 daughters and 2 sons, headed for the West Coast. Maybe Oregon, maybe California. It was going to be a monumental journey. It could take 5 months or more. You could travel 15 or 20 miles a day by horse and wagon if you didn't encounter a major obstacle. But they were determined. As they traveled into Oklahoma, they probably had no idea of the conflict between the United States government and the Native Americans. They were camped near the Oklahoma Panhandle when Willie was shot and killed. The details of what exactly happened were not passed down. But what we do know is that this left Mary Wallen, a widow, pregnant, and alone with 5 kids on the vast, desolate, open prairie. She was 1,200 miles from their destination and 800 miles from Jamestown. The youngest Wallen boy was Roy. He was 5 years old when it happened. Roy is my grandfather. They buried Willie on a hill nearby as they grieved. 10 days later, Mary's youngest child, Hazel, who was only 15 months old, pulled a pot of boiling jelly off the stove that spilled on her, and she died. Then later that day, in the depth of unspeakable grief, Mary went into labor and delivered a stillborn child. Somehow in her sorrow, Mary managed to sell the wagon and the horses to buy fare back to Jamestown, where she died of tuberculosis 4 years later. Now the Wallen kids were orphans. They were treated very badly by the Neal family. Roy said an orphan was treated 1 notch below a hound dog in those days. So Roy and his older brother Willard ran away. Roy was 9 or 10 years old, and Willard was about 14. Now, it was common in those days for people who were down and out to hide in a boxcar of a freight train or jump on it as it pulled out and travel to another destination. So the boys jumped a train headed north, through small towns, hobo camps, and rail yards, to make their way back to Missouri, where they had memories of a better life. They made it to the rail hub of St. Louis and then north to Macon, Missouri. And that's where the boys grew up. They worked hard and eventually had their own farms. Roy was particularly good with the machinery and later became a machinist, which was a prestigious occupation in those days. Macon, Missouri is where Roy met Grace. Grace May Ward had the beautiful, ideal look of her day. She was a quiet, sensitive woman who loved deeply and cared about others. She was a methodical worker. She made soap and washed clothes every Monday regardless. She was a good cook and always wore an apron in the kitchen. Grace is my grandmother. Her mother's maiden name was Rockwell. The Rockwell family had settled there years before and had a large family. Roy and Grace fell in love and were married. They honeymooned at Garden of the Gods in Colorado Springs and moved to an area just outside Denver called Barnum. It was where the Barnum and Bailey Circus kept their animals and equipment. Their first child was born there. They named him Roy Adrian Jr. He is my father. Roy grew up during the Great Depression with his best friend Marvin Croft and his cousin Johnny Ward. When World War II began, all three boys joined the military. Roy joined the Navy even though he was not technically old enough to enlist. He soon found himself in the Pacific Ocean near the Philippines on an aircraft carrier named the USS Princeton. One day, Japanese planes came in and dropped a torpedo in the water that hit the ship. Everyone was ordered to abandon the ship and swim as hard and fast as they could away from the ship so they wouldn't be sucked down when the ship sank. Roy was out in the water a very long time and finally passed out. Now Roy Sr. and Grace had heard about the ship and knew Roy was missing. It had been some time. They were grieving his death. One day the telephone rang and Grace answered. When she heard Roy's voice, she literally fainted and collapsed to the floor. Roy Sr. ran over to help her and grabbed the phone. It was Roy. He was alive. He had been recovering in a military hospital on an island somewhere out in the Pacific. After my dad completed his service in the Navy, he went home to Roy Sr. and Grace, who were living in Parker, Colorado at the east end of Main Street. Roy was loyal, hardworking, and tough. When I was little, I called him Daddy like my mom called her dad. One day, my dad said, "Don't call me that. Call me something else." "Like what?" "I don't know, but don't ever call me old man." I said, "Okay, how about I call you Pop?" He liked that. So from then on, we all called my dad Pop. Pop became the head mechanic at the American Can Company in Denver. He was highly respected and trusted by everyone at the factory. So much so that they voted him president of the Steelworkers Union in Denver. He took me on a union business trip to New York City when I was 7. Roy and Shirley met at Parker. They fell in love and were married. In 1952, Roy and Shirley had their first child. They named him Roy after his grandfather Wallen and Arvid after his grandfather Johnson. Roy Arvid Wallen. That was me.
When daylight breaks with morning dew, you are so good to me. When evening comes, the day is through, you are so good to me.
I was 16 years old. My Uncle Richard and I were moving cattle down Russellville Road to a different pasture that day, and I had to play the banjo on live radio that night. I was the banjo player with Buster Jenkins and the Rocky Mountain Jamboree every Saturday night. It was sort of a smaller regional version of the Grand Ole Opry in Denver. It was a live radio show on KLAK 1600, the right side of your dial. I'd been on my horse most of the day. I was sunburnt and tired, and I hadn't practiced all week. But I had one of my best performances. I got 2 standing ovations. Buster said, "Get back out there and give him some more."